Good morning. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I want to thank the Alliance for Girls for inviting me to come and speak to y'all this morning, and for our really beautiful presenters for sharing their gifts with us this morning. Thank you. It's very moving and heartening. As I begin my remarks this morning, I want to start with a simple question. Who runs the world? Who runs the world? Who runs the world? Who runs the world? That's right. And today we are going to talk about what we are going to do together. And specifically, I don't know about y'all, but I like to start my day by channeling a little Beyonce, maybe some Lizzo, right? We're going to talk about what we can do, and specifically how we, and I'm talking about we in this room, can break the intergenerational cycle of adversity. So, back in February of this year, I got a new job. And on his first day in office, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Executive Order N0219. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I just want to highlight a couple of the real good parts, right? Whereas California faces serious health challenges rooted in early social determinants of health. Whereas these challenges are not only serious, but inequitable, disproportionately impacting low-income Californians and community of color. Whereas some of the most pernicious but least addressed health challenges are the upstream factors that eventually become chronic and acute conditions that are far more difficult and expensive to treat. And whereas the overwhelming scientific consensus is that these upstream factors, including toxic stress and social determinants of health, are the causes of many of the most harmful and persistent health challenges facing Californians. Those were the words of our governor, right? Fast forward to the good part. He says, it is hereby ordered, right, to establish the position of Surgeon General, to advise the governor, to marshal the insights and the energy of medical professionals, scientists, academic experts, public health experts, public servants, and everyday Californians, and to be a spokesperson to bring this science to improve the health of our people. Right? And so in coming into office, my first order of business when I was sworn in by the governor was to focus on issues of health equity, early childhood, and adverse childhood experiences, and toxic stress. Now, before I move into my comments, I want to bring Emma's words back into the conversation and back to the front of our minds. The stuff that we're going to talk about, some of it is really challenging. We're talking about adversity. We're talking about trauma. So if anyone needs to step out and excuse themselves, of course, please take care of yourselves. But the reason that we're talking about this issue is because I believe that this conversation is a fundamentally hopeful one, right? I wouldn't be up here if I didn't believe it, because what we are doing now and what we will be doing moving forward is about transformation. It's about taking things out of the dark and putting them into the light. It's about recognizing that this is not what many people think, that this only happens in certain communities, or it only happens in certain zip codes, or that it only happened to me, right? And recognizing that this is all of us, and together, when we address these issues together, we are stronger and we can beat it. So to start, how many people are familiar with with adverse childhood experience is, right? And oh, dang, yes! So the 10 traditional adverse childhood experiences that were investigated by the study by the CDC and Kaiser include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent was mentally ill, substance dependent, incarcerated, where there was parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. And there were two really big things that the ACE study found that were game changers, right? The first one was that ACEs are incredibly common. So, 2/3 of folks had experienced at least one. 1 in 8 folks had experienced 4 or more. Here in California, 63.5% of folks across our state have experienced at least one. 17.6% of Californians have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, right? When we look at the data across race and ethnicity, what we see is that the prevalence, how common adverse childhood experiences are, when you look at the traditional ACEs, actually pretty similar across racial groups, right? We see in California here, between whites, African Americans, and Hispanic and Latinos, the numbers look very same, with a slightly lower prevalence reported among Asian and Pacific Islanders. But there's when I talk to communities of Black folks about ACEs, they're like, ACEs, we know ACEs, we got ACEs. When I'm in a room full of Caucasian folks and I talk about ACEs, they're like, we know ACEs, we have ACEs. And it's the same thing in every community that I talk to, right? But we also recognize a couple of things, and I want to just flag that the original ACEs didn't ask about racial discrimination, right? It didn't ask about discrimination on the basis of gender or gender identity. And we recognize that these things also impact our health and our well-being. We also recognize that what the data does show, right, is that even though the original ACE study, was done, Kaiser, 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated, is that when we look, and in that study we saw, 1 in 8 folks, 12.6% had 4 or more ACEs. When we look across income, right, that in our low-income communities, we do see a higher rate of ACEs. And in this particular study, what was found, so while 1 in 8 folks in middle-income communities have 4 or more ACEs, it's greater than 1 in 4 among our low-income communities, right? And I think for those of us who have, dedicated our career to caring for low-income communities, or who have grown up in low-income communities, it's like, oh yeah, thanks, Dr. Burke Harris. You've just shown us data that says water is wet. Like, we all knew that. But when you have the numbers, it's good, so you can highlight it to people and recognize, bring the data so that we can bring resources and marshal the resources. When we look among women and girls, what we see is that the National Crittenden Foundation, how many folks know the National Crittenden Foundation? They're a national organization that does work with women and girls. They did an ACE survey among their organizations. And what they found was that half of all girls and 61% of the young mothers that in their organizations had 4 or more ACEs, right? 82% of young mothers in residential treatment had 4 or more ACEs, and 74% of young mothers in the juvenile justice system had 4 or more ACEs. A study in New Haven among African-American adolescent girls showed that 38% had witnessed domestic violence. Half had been a victim of physical violence, and more than a third had been a victim of sexual assault. In San Francisco, right across the bay, we did a study of urban high school girls who are more than 80% Latino, African American, or biracial, and the average ACE score was 4.5, right? 51% had experienced emotional abuse, right? I think that one of the things that we hear is really common is that if someone doesn't lay hands on you, right, it can't be abuse. And thank God that is something where our perceptions of that are changing and that we recognize that emotional abuse can be just as damaging. And 41% had experienced physical abuse. So the second big thing that the ACE study showed, which you guys already know because you all already, look, so many hands went up, you guys are all experts, is that ACEs are, it turns out, right, really bad for our health. And that for individuals with 4 or more ACEs, we see a dramatically increased risk for 8 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the US. And for individuals with 6 or more ACEs, there can be as much of a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And part of the reason that I bring this up and why this is so important is because when we think about how we are going to solve this issue, right? When I first learned about the ACE study, the first thing I did was try to figure out, okay, how are we gonna solve this, right? I'm seeing this every day in my patients, but not just in my patients, come on, in my family, in my community, and the people who I love and care for. And so how do we solve this? And, you know, I was in the role of the medical director of the Bayview Child Health Center, the clinic that I had started, and I did one of the scariest things that I ever did. Oh, dang! Not that scary thing. The scariest thing that I ever did, I moved from being a full-time doctor, right, which is what I had been trained to do for the last very, very long period of time, to founding the Center for Youth Wellness to change the way our society responds to adverse childhood experiences. And it started with understanding how this works, right? Because when we understand how it works, then we can use that knowledge and apply it to figuring out, okay, so how do we dismantle these processes? How do we interrupt this progression? And so it goes a little something like this, right? When we understand how do we get from early adversity to disease and early death, it all boils down to our body's stress response system. If you're walking in the forest and you see this guy, right? Now it's time for the bear, right? What happens? What happens in our brains and bodies, right? Immediately our amygdala, that fear, the brain's fear center, sounds the alarm, right? And our body releases tons of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. So our hearts start to pound, right? That rabbit heart that we heard about earlier. Our pupils dilate, our airways open up. We shunt all this blood to our big muscles for running and jumping, right? So we can fight the bear away from that itty bitty muscle that holds your bladder closed so you may pee your pants. No shame, right? But if you were to think about it, right, fighting a bear wouldn't seem like a good idea. And that's why your brain's fear center sends a message to the part of your brain up here, the prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for impulse control and judgment and executive functioning. And it turns it way, way down. Because if you're in a forest and you're fighting a bear, you don't want impulse control getting in the way of survival, right? And instead what it does is it turns up the part of the brain, it's called the noradrenergic nucleus of the locus ceruleus, or as I like to call it, the part of the brain responsible for, I don't know karate, but I do know crazy, right? This is our within the brain stress response center, and it gets us amped up. And the last thing, not so obvious, is that when you activate your stress response, it also activates your immune response, because if that bear gets his claws into you, you want your immune system to be primed to bring inflammation to stabilize that wound so that you can live long enough or to get away, right? You remember Leo DiCaprio in The Revenant? Did anybody see that movie? You ever wonder how he survived that? Right? That was the inflammation stabilizing him so he could live long enough, right? That's our fight or flight system. It's brilliant. It was designed over millennia to save our lives from a mortal threat. But the question is, what happens when that bear comes home every night, right? And this biological process is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. And the impacts of an overactive stress response, right? One of the things that's critically important is that kids are especially vulnerable to repeated activation of the stress response because their brains and bodies are just developing. So high doses of adversity in kids, right, affects their developing brains, but also their developing immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way their DNA is read and transcribed. And as doctors, we see this in everything from, babies' sleep disruption, to their ability to grow, to the risk of asthma or pneumonia or other infections, to the chances that you have, chronic headache or abdominal pain, or your likelihood of getting pregnant as a teenager. And for our young women who do get pregnant, right, one of the things that we see is that that adversity that we experience as children, we carry it with us. And it can affect our risk of the health of our pregnancy, right? And the health of our unborn child. You just heard earlier about the maternal mortality disparity, how African American women are more likely to die in childbirth. And there are so many drivers behind that, including inequity, unequal care, how women of color are listened to, but it's also the stress and trauma and adversity that we experience that literally gets under our skin and changes our biology. And now for the hopeful and exciting part, right? Because that feels pretty, that's hard, right? Like when we think about this is hard. And I will tell you, when I first read all of this research, I definitely thought about it in terms of my patients and my community. But to be honest, I also thought about it in terms of myself. I grew up in a household with a mom who was severely mentally ill and who didn't get treatment for a really long time. And if there's one thing that I thought and experienced when I read the science, it was, you know what? We figured out how to cure cancer, right? We've taken HIV/AIDS from a 6-month mortality to an average life expectancy on standard treatment of over 50 years. We can lick this. So when we understand the science of the changes to the brain, immune system, hormonal systems, right? This overactivity of the stress response that leads to this biological process known as toxic stress, we can also recognize, right, that there are ways to biologically interrupt this process. And one of the things that we learn is that safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments are healing. And when I say healing, right, I'm not talking just about like, oh, phew, okay, I feel a little better, right? I am talking about in babies who get nurturant care, newborns, when they measure their biology, they show improved stress reactivity, better functioning of their nervous system, right? Better maturation of that prefrontal cortex. You remember the prefrontal cortex, executive functioning and judgment, all that stuff? Nurturing care actually improves the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. And not only that, right? To the point where they've done randomized controlled trials, right? This is the highest standard of medical evidence, where they found that kids who were randomized into high quality nurturant care, they saw changes on their MRI studies, measurable changes in the structure and function of their brains. We can heal this, right? We see that things like diet, omega-3 fatty acids, things like exercise. So exercise is something I wanted to pause just one sec. So exercise, not only does it do good stuff like release all those endorphins that make you feel really good and counteract any, challenges with mood and all that kind of stuff, exercise also releases something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. Essentially what that is miracle grow for brain cells, right? And it allows brain cells to make new connections, something called neuroplasticity. So for those of us who have experienced ACEs, every time you get out there and you hit the gym, you go for that swim, you go for that walk, you go to that yoga class, just know that you are releasing BDNF into your brain and you are healing, right, yourself from the inside out. We also see things like meditation improves the functioning of our immune system. Social support, that's one of my favorite things. What we're doing in this room right now, this powerful connection, the good news is that we're not just advancing equity for women and girls today, but the social support, the sense of community, that sense of connection, it's healing, right? Oxytocin is the one I love, right? Oxytocin, so you imagine we have the stress response. It's normal. It was designed to save our lives from a mortal threat, but if it's activated too often, right, it can be harmful. But when our stress response is activated, you can imagine that our body had a natural way to bring us back into balance. And you know what that natural way is? Oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone. It interrupts the stress response, right? It enhances bonding. It protects against stress-induced cell death. It's anti-inflammatory. It regulates your metabolism, right? It protects the lining on the inside of your arteries. Who do you think is the #1 global manufacturer of oxytocin? It's not Purdue Pharma. It's not Merck. It's not GlaxoSmithKline. It's women. We make oxytocin. Men do too, but in lower amounts. But good on you for our brethren, right? but it's women. And in fact, we, within ourselves, within our biology, every time you get a hug from someone who cares deeply about you, it releases oxytocin, right? Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships release oxytocin and buffer the biological stress response, and that is why it is fundamentally healing. So when we look at how do we heal, right? It's sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health. Don't forget about mental health, y'all, right? And healthy relationships. Now, these are all things that are really powerful on the individual and on the interpersonal level. But in my new job, which I have to say is my favorite job that I've ever had, right? As Surgeon General of California, what we're looking at is how do we do this across the spectrum? How do we do this on a large scale? And one of the things that is so exciting to me, right, is that what my job is, right, is to figure out, number one, how do we increase the sources of buffering on a societal level, right? Just as when you add up the ACEs, that leads to increased risk, when you add up the buffering, that leads to decreased risk. And as Surgeon General, I have the opportunity to work with educators, the justice system, with early childhood, healthcare, all across our systems, right? We are going to start doing education and training about how every single one of us can be a buffer to a young person in need. And I have to say, starting in healthcare, California is the first state that is going to, across the board, we're going to be doing routine screening for adverse childhood experiences, so that because we know that early detection and early intervention makes a difference. My boss, the governor, put $40.8 million behind reimbursing doctors to do this. And another $50 million over 3 years to help me train our 88,000 providers who care for Medicaid patients across our state on how to screen, right? And how to respond with trauma-informed care, right? California is doing this. But as we move forward in not only doing screening and trauma-informed response in hospitals and clinics and doctors' offices, right? But then also raising awareness so all of us recognize how we can be a buffer. As we do this work, right, we recognize that for any of us to be an effective buffer, we ourselves have to be whole and intact. And that means we got to do some self-care, y'all, right? So I want to invite everyone in this room today to go home and do some self-care. Self-care isn't selfish. We can break the cycle and be the first generation to stop the intergenerational cycle of adverse childhood experiences. Thank you.